Good afternoon. Am I starting? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Emily Swan, President of the Board of the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2020 annual meeting. As I'm sure you know, this is our first virtual annual meeting, and it's gratifying to have so many of you tuning in. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the law firm of Eaton Peabody, our event sponsor for this evening. We are grateful for their support. Gratitude seems like the appropriate theme for the evening. This has been a year of unimaginable challenges, and yet we have come through it stronger than ever, and for that, we owe a debt of gratitude to so many people. First of all, to our phenomenal staff. As the pandemic became entrenched last spring, and it became clear this was not just a short-term disruption, our ever-resourceful, committed, and hardworking staff pivoted from in-person meetings and activities to virtual ones and socially distanced ones, and hardworking, and the land conservation, stewardship, and program work that are central to our mission continued with scarcely a hiccup. They also created a series of weekly newsletters that were met with an enthusiastic response from our members. These were full of resources for learning about and engaging with nature and BTLT properties safely during the pandemic, and for supporting local farmers and BTLT business partners and members. Although pandemic safety requirements made it impossible to continue holding our weekly farmers market on the hilltop at Crystal Spring Farm, our staff worked with the Brunswick School Department and later with Flight Deck Brewing Company to create temporary market sites, first in the Brunswick High School parking lot and then in the Flight Deck lot. We are proud that we were able to maintain this crucial link between local farmers and all of us who rely on the fresh, sustainably produced food they provide. Special thanks here go to market manager Jackie Koopman, who is retiring after 8 years of ably running the market, with no year more challenging than the one just completed. Thank you, Jackie, for a job well done. I hope you enjoy the restful, leisurely Saturday mornings that await you next spring and summer. Nor did the pandemic prevent the Tom Saddlemeyer Community Garden from opening on time with safety measures in place to prevent the spread of COVID in this shared space. Under the leadership of volunteer extraordinaire Dev Culver and his wonderful team of volunteers, our Common Good Garden grew almost 2 tons of fresh, healthy food for Mid-Coast hunger prevention when its clients needed it more than ever. And we have engaged more high school students and new Mainers with the garden. They increased the size of the Common Good Garden. They added a hoop house, a pollinator garden, and much more. Last, but far from least among the silver linings in the dark clouds that have dominated these last few months are you, our members. You have shown us how much you value BTLT and the resources it offers our community with your supportive feedback and with membership renewals at record levels. You are the Land Trust, and this year finds it an organization challenged but strong and stable thanks to you. Although our organization is strong, it is not perfect. And we recognize that as individuals and as a land trust, we have much to do to make our lands, our organization, and our programs more inclusive and welcoming to people and groups that are underrepresented in our membership. We have created a working group on equity and inclusion and have embarked on a process of listening, self-examination, and action to try to do just that. Please contact our office if you're interested in getting involved in this effort. The theme of the Land Trust outreach this year has been getting to know your land. With the pandemic foreclosing so many other activities, trails on BTLT properties have seen heavy use, and we are so glad that we have been able to offer this outlet for physical activity, connection with nature and with friends and family, and spiritual solace during these trying times. Getting to know the land also means gaining a clearer understanding of its history, including the ways it supported and nurtured Indigenous peoples and of the barriers that exist today to their traditional relationship with the land. Tonight's program will help us all learn more about this, and I know that for many of you, that is why you are here. So without further ado, let's proceed to our program for the evening. I'll now turn the floor over to our Executive Director, Angela Twitchell. First, she'll brief you on the order of events for the evening, and then she'll share with us some highlights of the Land Trust's work and accomplishments over the past year, presented in a brand new way for this first ever virtual annual meeting. Again, thank you for coming and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Emily. And thanks to all of you for being here. We are all excited and a little bit nervous about going virtual. And we appreciate you being here with us. At last count, we had 278 registrants for the annual meeting, and that is by far a record for this organization. And even though we can't be together in person, we are excited to share our work from the last year with you via Zoom. The agenda for the afternoon is, I will be sharing some highlights of the past year. Then there will be a short business meeting, which should conclude around 4:40. After that, we'll turn to our special program, Indigenous Landscape in Our Community, where I think we are all excited to hear from Kerry Hardy and Joseph Hall. Sharing the highlights of the year for BTLT is always one of my favorite parts of annual meeting. Throughout much of the year, many of us are bogged down in the minutia and tiny stressors of the day-to-day work, and being able to take a look back at all that we've accomplished together in the year always feels good. And especially this year, when the pandemic has forced us to so often focus on all of the many things that we cannot do, we are really happy to be able to focus on all of the good things that BTLT was able to do to support our community in the past year. Continuing with Emily's theme of gratitude, it's really important to me to acknowledge the BTLT's board of directors, staff, volunteers, and members for your unwavering support, flexibility, hard work, and can-do spirit. I've never been more proud to work for the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust than I am this year. In the face of overwhelming challenges, every single person in the BTLT family came together and helped figure out how we could best support our community, make a bigger impact, and more fully implement our mission. Thank you all. With the goal of reducing the number of Zoom call talking heads at this meeting, we have worked with 2 extraordinary volunteers to create short videos to help share the work that we have accomplished this year with you. Up first, Rob Moore has created a video tour of our new office space at Brunswick Landing, where you can see I am tonight. Moving in the midst of a global pandemic was very challenging, but we're thrilled to be in the new space and look forward to sharing it with you in person in the future. Rob Moore is owed a great debt of thanks, not just for creating this video, but for being our volunteer IT expert as we accomplish the move and as we face IT challenges moving forward. Rob, thanks so much for all you do. We really honestly couldn't have completed this move without you. And Dakota is going to key the video. One of the things we love most about the new office is being able to walk out our doors to get out and walk on the trails and enjoy properties that we've conserved. So next time you're on Brunswick Landing, hopefully you will walk by our offices and enjoy the trails nearby at Neptune Woods. Up next, we have approximately 15-minute video highlighting BTLT's program successes from the past year. And we were really fortunate to be introduced to Robert White of Rob White Photography through one of our longtime members. Robert volunteered his time and talents to create this video, and we're extremely grateful. I also want to thank Jim St. Pierre, who always contributes his lovely photos throughout the year, but many of them you'll notice highlighted in this video. We hope that highlighting our work in this video format will give you a real sense of what you've helped us accomplish in the last year.
The Farmers Market is BTLT's most beloved program, with thousands of people visiting the market each season. This year was no exception, despite COVID unfurling across the globe. This did cause us to have to move the market twice and completely restructure how we run the market in order to make it a safe space. None of this would have been possible if it weren't for the incredible community of food producers that make up our farmers market. This season has also been Jackie's last year as the market manager, and we are thankful for her years of dedication to both local food and BTLT. Grow for Midcoast Hunger Prevention Program, and that is almost entirely a volunteer-led initiative. They do the work. This year they picked the crops. This year they did everything. They were just incredibly amazing group to work with. Expanded the garden from 6,000 square feet to 11,000 square feet, and more than doubled what they grew for Midcoast Hunger, even with an early frost where we lost like 1,000 pounds of food. But they put in late season crops, which is what you see here. It's broccoli, something we've never done in the gardens. And they put in a whole hoop house, and they've been working on that for basically all summer. They've done the planning, they've gotten all the parts. They worked with a local farmer to help do the design. They worked with that same farmer, Crystal Spring Farm, the family that runs that farm, to get plants to do late season and winter growing for Midcoast Hunger, which is something Midcoast Hunger had asked us for. It is amazing what they have done with their own initiative. We're very fortunate, very, very fortunate to have such a dedicated group of people that care so much about the community and the garden in this place.
My name is Lily Hattrick, and I have been volunteering here at the Common Good Garden for this whole summer. I started in the early spring. So yeah, I've been working here through, laying down all the irrigation, laying down the plastic, planting everything, the many months of watering, and then now getting to harvesting and building the hoop house, obviously. I also was able to kind of build what's called an ELO with my school, an extended learning opportunity, or kind of like an internship. So hopefully in the future, people will be able to kind of interview for that internship, and we can continue this bond between the garden and the high school and keep gardening, yeah.
So one of the things that I've been really invested in through my volunteer time is to help facilitate the garden itself, providing inventory for our annual Taking Root plant sale. For me, the garden was always about a place to get grounded in the community and grounded in kind of the ecosystem of the land. And so one of the things I really appreciate about the Tom Settlemyre Community Garden is this sense of community.
This fiscal year, BTLT has expanded the breadth of programs and events that we offer, largely due to partnerships with other community organizations. So we've been able to offer yoga, cross-country skiing, fat tire biking. We've celebrated the 25th anniversary of the conservation of Crystal Spring Farm. We've partnered with Forest Play Group to engage more young families in BTLT's work. We've expanded our education program at Perryman Village. We have started a new partnership with Cathay's River Education Alliance that will expand the ways that we offer outdoor education to the community. And while COVID has certainly impacted how we engage with the community, it hasn't stopped us from launching our Stewardship Tour series, which is a way for the community to learn about conservation and land use. And we will continue to be flexible in meeting the needs of our community.
So again, we're in Pennellville, and I wanted to talk to you just briefly to describe this fabulous easement that we closed on this year, the Isbill easement. And so many thanks again to the landowner. This is an 18-acre parcel, and it is an interesting piece because it grew up here in Pennellville from what was probably 100 years ago cleared agricultural fields. And at this point it's almost entirely wooded, and almost all of that forest grew up. It's uniform age now because it just all grew up at the same time up out of the fields. That part that probably takes up I would say 3/4 of this parcel, and then down toward Middle Bay proper, there is the more, I would say it's a more mixed forest that is the actual buffer down and protects the shoreline of Middle Bay. It is, you know, each of these projects we take a look at is, well, what are the conservation values that we are trying to preserve here? Why do we do a project? And I think this Isbill project is a lovely example. So let me tell you about what the most recent easement is that we were able to acquire. 133 acres, the LaChance property in the Highland Road area of Brunswick, and it is a different property than I've been describing earlier today, because it is a working family farm. It's not on any of the rivers or the bays where we have been focusing a lot of our energy, but of course part of BTLT's mission is to conserve the working and prime agricultural areas in Bowdoin, Brunswick, and Topsham. And again, we may have the opportunity over time. One of the conservation values that we identified is that we may be able to have some public access for a trail across a portion of the parcel. So again, very exciting that we were able to close on a project over in that Highland Road area, because it's been identified by the residents of Brunswick for years as just a critical area for the viewshed for its rural qualities. And so we hope by next year we'll have a couple of other exciting projects that we can give you some details about.
This year, our largest stewardship trail project was replacing rotten bog bridging on the Heath Loop at Cadence River Nature Preserve, a 231-acre easement property with fantastic public trails. Over 9,000 linear feet of bog bridging can be found on the preserve, with much of it located on the Heath Loop, and that's a lot of bog bridging to maintain. So for safety reasons, we had to close the west side of the Heath Loop, where there's the most rotten bog bridging this year. But the Heath is beloved by so many and is such a rare natural community in this part of the state that we wanted to keep it accessible. Visitors are treated to beautiful views, are able to sit in peace and experience the unique plants and animals like the sundew and the beaver that call this place home. And they're also able to walk in between the feldspar quarries that represent a part of history and what was once a thriving industry in the area. Summer staff were able to rip up and replace over 100 feet of rotten bog bridging along the Heath Loop this summer, as well as reroute portions of the trail onto higher and drier land. With these improvements and others planned in the near future, we hope that this will enable folks to continue to enjoy this hidden gem for years to come. This fall, the Land Trust was able to partner with Kate Furbish Elementary School in Brunswick to build a short loop trail in the woods found behind the school. Land Trust staff and a few volunteers were able to socially distance and work together to build the trail by removing invasive bittersweet, barberry, clearing trash, and removing downed trees. A number of gathering places were cleared along the trail where students can spread out and sit on stumps that were cut from the fallen trees. This loop trail provides outdoor space for students and teachers alike to learn, explore, and observe nature. This summer, the Land Trust partnered with Larry Totten of the American Chestnut Foundation to plant 20 wild American chestnut seedlings on Tarbox Preserve in Topsham. Larry provided Land Trust staff and volunteers with the knowledge and expertise to prepare the site and plant the seedlings, and the Land Trust monitored the health of the seedlings and watered them weekly throughout the summer as the state experienced drought conditions. These small chestnut seedlings will eventually grow into a small grove and help preserve the genes of the American chestnut tree. Every year, the Land Trust monitors each and every property that has been conserved. This year, staff and dedicated volunteers monitored over 3,000 acres throughout Brunswick, Topsham, and Bowdoin. Monitoring is at the core of our stewardship work and plays a crucial role in ensuring that the conservation values of a property remain intact year after year. It also provides the opportunity to meet and talk with easement landowners and to strengthen relationships with community members who are our partners in conservation. By monitoring the health of the plants and wildlife, identifying and marking boundaries, and observing human uses on conserved properties, we can better understand the changes we see over time and how to manage properties in a way that will help protect what makes them so special.
again to those great volunteers who made those videos possible. I think it brings our work to life a lot more than just me telling you about the project. So I'm proud to share those with you. I hope that these presentations have given you a glimpse into how important your support is and the many ways in which your generosity is contributing to helping our community thrive during these difficult times. You'll be able to learn more about these projects and others in our annual report, which should be arriving in your mailbox in the next couple of days. And as always, if you have questions about anything going on at your land trust, feel free to contact the office or go to our website or social media sites. Lastly, I know, as we all do, that many challenges remain in front of us in the coming months. But I also know that the BTLT family is strong and deeply committed to facing these challenges together with the shared goal of supporting our community now and into the future. Many thanks to all of you for the part that you play in making our work possible. I would like to once again thank Eaton Peabody for their sponsorship of this annual meeting. Another true silver lining of this pandemic year is the incredible support that we have continued to receive from our members as well as our business supporters, and Eaton Peabody's support of this annual meeting is an example of that. Next up is BTLT Treasurer Jamie Tatham with an annual review of BTLT's financial situation.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks everybody for attending. Kind of wishing I had made a video, but we'll try to make the financial piece of this as exciting as we can for you all. I would like to just start by giving a brief overview of the last 9 months and what we've done in our financial position and planning. In March, when the current crisis started, we immediately focused on our operational liquidity to make sure that we could meet our financial obligations and determine if we would need to modify any of our planned expenditures. The organization was well positioned when the crisis began, as we are now, and we never reached a point where we need to make significant budget reductions. So that was great for the organization to be able to continue on. We did trim around the edges a little bit here and there, but we didn't need to do any significant budget cuts. And fortunately, as May and June came and went, the financial support from the community remained strong, and that allowed us to continue to end the year without any changes to our budget. So that was really good from an organizational standpoint as we started the crisis and as we went through the end of last fiscal year. We also took a really close look at our endowment. We focused a lot on our asset allocation strategy, and we made no changes to that strategy. We did not change any of our targets, and the endowment has fared well during this time period. So that was another thing that worked out very well for us and continues to work out well for us. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of that, just to let you know, the organization, we have a great team in place. We have appropriate procedures to steward our assets in both times of crisis and a normal time period, which we'll get back to soon here. I want to turn to the future here briefly. As spring and summer unfolded, it became apparent to us that stewardship expenses were important. I mean, they're always have been important to us. And the work that we just talked about, or you just saw in the video about the Heath Bog bridges, we really wanted to make sure that our operating dollars were in place to continue that work, because as spring and summer continued on, more and more people sought outdoor spaces to enjoy and try to find that quiet spot. And sometimes those spots were really popular and not as quiet as normal, but it was great to have those in place, and it was great that we were able to continue to put our dollars in those places as the summer went along. And looking to our next fiscal year, we do have a modest budget increase that we're able to do. It's driven by a fairly large increase in our stewardship budget, which we're really proud to do. It's a 12% increase on the stewardship budget. And making that possible is the continued growth and support in our endowment. The endowment currently supports 18% of our stewardship budget. And so that's a great starting point for us. And we're continuing to try to put resources into the endowment to have that financial support available. So that's a real quick look at our last 9 months and our next fiscal year. Thank you all for attending. And I'll just close with, the organization is positioned well. We have plans in place to carry on our operations uninterrupted, and we will continue to act thoughtfully and responsibly with our finances as we move forward. I'll now turn over to Brad Babson, who will lead the governance portion of the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're good, Brad. We can hear you.
Can you see me?
We can.
Okay, sorry. Well, first of all, in addition to the financial strength of the BTLT, I think one of our greatest strengths is the leadership of BTLT, not only our wonderful executive director, Angela, but the really important leadership that's provided through the board of directors and the officers who guide us in policy and in ways that we can strengthen the organization and support the staff. This is the part of the meeting where we need your help, because this is the time when we need to appoint a new extension of service for directors and for 3-year terms, and for officers for 1-year term. So I would like to say that we, in voting virtually, what we have prepared is for me to make a proposal for a slate of directors, and followed by a posting that you will see on your screen, where you can make a mark to affirm or not affirm our recommended slate of directors. And that will be posted for 30 seconds. After that election, we will do the same for our for our slate of officers. And that will provide you an opportunity to contribute to the decision-making of our leadership as we go forward over the next year. For the directors, what I am proposing is a slate of 5 directors whose terms are expiring, but who have been willing to extend their directorships for an additional 3-year terms. And so that slate includes Emily Swan, Richard Mercereau, Jeff Nelson, Jamie Tatum, and Avril Feasanton. And I would like to just remind you that those of you who are members are asked to vote. If you are not a member and attending, we would ask that you not vote. So please indicate on the post that has been posted, that has been put on your screen, whether you are in support or not, and then please push the submit button as soon as you can. And as I say, we'll have 30 seconds for this voting of the directors. Thank you. I'm happy to report that we have a unanimous vote of support for our new, for our extension of our 5 directors. I appreciate for that very much. The BTLT does not have term limits, which is a question that just came to me, but there are extensions of 3-year terms as long as both the director and the board feel that that continues to be appropriate to give us continuity with history. I'd now like to propose our officers for the coming years, which is a continuation of our current slate of officers, which is the president of Emily Swan, vice president Margaret Wilson, Treasurer Jamie Tatum, and Secretary Bill Ferdinand. So there will be a posting coming up for you, and please vote again. The question has come of whether there are term limits for officers, and the answer is each officer appointment is for a single year. There is no term limit for how many years an officer can be reappointed. We are also want to have evolutions and diversification of our leadership, which is a major part of our organizational development efforts. And I now would like to also to announce that we have a unanimous approval of our slate of officers for the coming year. So I thank you very much, and would like now to turn the program over to Lee Cataldo, our Director of Programs, to introduce our special speakers for the evening. Thanks again.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I would like to start this segment of the evening with a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge that the work of Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust and the land where most of you are likely gathered today is the traditional land of the Wabanaki people, past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. And this calls us to commit to learning more about how to be better stewards of the land that we inhabit. I want to be clear that we recognize this acknowledgement by itself is only a gesture. It can only become meaningful when it's combined with an honest reckoning with the past, authentic relationship building, and informed action. This is the work we are engaged in as a land conservation organization, and we're doing our best to assure that our conservation efforts are inclusive and just. We welcome you here tonight to get to know the land in your community a little bit better. I would wager that virtually every person in this virtual room grew up learning an incomplete and often false history of this land, a history that did not include the experience of the Wabanaki people, who have lived here for at least 10,000 years and still live here today. Though we may not have personally hurt Wabanaki people, we are inheriting a history that is ongoing, with our state today still enacting efforts to take land from the Wabanaki people. BTLT and members of and other members of the land trust community have been working hard to build relationships and trust within the Wabanaki community, as well as a true and complete understanding of the places we call home. BTLT was an early participant in the First Light Learning Journey, which began over 3 years ago, and is an ongoing effort to build trust between the tribes and the conservation community. I've heard many times recently from members of the Wabanaki community, and then very resonantly, as well as an Albert Einstein quote that was shared with me through the Maine Environmental Educators Association, that you can't use the same system that caused a problem to fix that problem. This is at the heart of why I think it's so important for the conservation community to build relationships with Indigenous communities. Our Western culture of consumption and, in many cases, destruction likely isn't going to have the answers for the deep environmental problems that it has caused and which the conservation world is trying to address. That's why, to me, it makes sense that we start to engage with and learn from a culture whose fundamental precepts are different seeing humanity as a string in the web of the natural world, not something separate from it. And for all the pride that I have in our conservation efforts, I also acknowledge the conservation world has a dark stain on its founding, and there is ongoing injustice toward people of color, including Indigenous people. And so that's a big part of why, as Emily mentioned, this year BTLT established a diversity, equity, and inclusion work group to help us dig into our own blind spots and inequitable relationships with the land that we might be participant in. I want to welcome, we're lucky to have here tonight one of the members of BTLT's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion work group. Heather Augustine is the main community organizer for Maine Wabanaki Reach, which is the organization that came out of the TRC that you hopefully learned about in the film Dawnland. She's a resident of Brunswick and is the founder of Wabanaki Edge. Forgive me, Heather, if I've said that incorrectly. I hope you'll share it properly with us, which is a First Nation youth group, a group for Wabanaki families to come together to enjoy community, traditional foods, and learn about their culture. And this year the group had a plot at the, I believe last year as well, a plot at the Tom Settlemyre Community Garden. And Heather and the youth that participate in the group grew over 700 pounds of food this season that's being distributed throughout the urban Wabanaki community. So I invited her tonight to just speak briefly about the film that I hope you all either saw or will see soon, and a little bit more about Reach, which is an amazing resource if you want to learn more about being an ally. So Heather.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate your support and invitation to the equity work group. And here's just a little bit of information about Maine Wabanaki Reach. Maine Wabanaki Reach is a cross-cultural organization working in support of decolonization and Wabanaki self-determination. REACH stands for Restoration, Engagement, Advocacy, Change, and Healing. Our work with Wabanaki people is flexible, responding to activities in the communities themselves. It includes wellness and history learning, healing circles, support for growing food and medicines, and emergency financial support. This work takes place in Wabanaki communities, Maine communities, and in the Maine State Correctional System. Our work with non-Native people around Maine and beyond includes learning about the history and ongoing relationships of Native and non-Native people, understanding colonization and the work of decolonization. I am grateful to be here in Wabanaki territory. I am a Wabanaki person. I'm from the Elsipogtog First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. I know that these lands and waters were taken as a resource for a colonial system that continues to this day. This taking caused great harm to the Wabanaki people. Today, we can all commit ourselves to a process of truth, healing, and change. We can begin or continue to advocate for restoration in this place. And I want to thank the Wabanaki people for their ongoing care of this place. Dawnland, the documentary that some of you may all have seen, is it's about the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC. Filmmakers Adam Mazo and Ben Pedler-Kudlip follow the TRC to contemporary Wabanaki communities to witness intimate, sacred moments of truth-telling and healing. Both the 86-minute feature film or the 54-minute broadcast film are available for programming, followed by a panel discussion with members of Maine Wabanaki Reach. You can find my contact information on the Maine Wabanaki Reach website or Facebook page if you're interested in bringing any of our community programming to your community. Thank you so much. And I appreciate Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust in donating the 2 plots of land over the last 2 years for our youth group. We had so much fun, and I really believe that the Tom Settlemyre Community Garden is an absolutely sacred place. We love being there. It's been a very healing experience, especially during the pandemic. So I just want to express my gratitude for your generosity. Thank you so much. Will Allen.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm so grateful that Heather was able to join us tonight and share a little bit about the work that she's been doing. I do want to recognize an important facet of tonight's presentation and what is missing. Tonight, you will not be learning Indigenous past from Indigenous speakers. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the incompleteness of learning someone else's story from not those people. However, I see tonight as a starting place for us to get to know our land a little bit better, and a start is better than no start at all. And we chose this start because our tribal allies have made it clear that we can't ask them to do all the work for us as we try to undo our own ignorance. We've asked these two men to speak tonight because their research is well regarded by many in the Wabanaki community, and they've undertaken their work with humility and consistent efforts to learn where they can from tribal partners. But I really want you all to keep in mind tonight, we're hearing things from a Western cultural perspective. We're hearing stories about another culture from the viewpoints of our own. For instance, you're likely to hear tonight that the Wabanaki and Maine have been here since the end of the last ice age, around 13,000 years ago, which is what our modern scientific evidence tells us. However, the Wabanaki tradition will tell you that they've always been here, since Gluskop shot an arrow into the ash tree and the first people spilled forth from that important tree. There's no more truth to one story or the other. They're both just the stories we tell ourselves from the evidence we can see around us. The only difference is culture and perspective. But I do think this is an important starting point for all of us tonight. I do hope that you'll all have the opportunity to learn more from Wabanaki people about their relationships with this land. I hope you all watched the film Dawnland, which is so important to all of us to understand. In addition, you can visit the First Light Learning Journey website, and I'll share that in the chat in just a minute, for a host of other valuable resources ranging from history to legal issues to cultural resources. And we also look forward to future opportunities where we can share with you the voices and knowledge of tribal members. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started with our speakers. First, we're going to welcome Kerry Hardy, author of Notes on a Lost Flute, and then Joseph Hall, professor of history at Bates College, will share some of his research with you. We will conclude with a question and answer session at the end. At any point, you can enter your questions using the Q&A function. Please try to use the Q&A function, not the chat at the bottom of your screen. I will read those questions or summarize questions that are similar for our speakers at the end of both of their presentations. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker, Kerry Hardy. Oops, there we go. Oops. You're muted, Kerry. I think you must, there you go. You're still muted.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay. The mute button that spoils so much. Okay. Well, thank you. And it's nice to be talking. Wow, to 155 people, it looks like. I'm as much a fish out of water in this age of Zoom conferencing as anybody, so I will apologize if anything seems disjointed. My talks usually are, even when I do them in person, so I would expect they'll be even more so in Zoom. But I'm just going to talk about really a very few subjects tonight, and I'm going to try to stick to that 25 minutes that Lee told me about. So let's see if I can share my screen with you. And how about that? Can people see a what looks like a rock with a hole in it? Okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to move back and forth between your land trust's service area and some other parts of the world. And this is almost in your service area. This is a stone that fits in the palm of your hand, and it came into my possession briefly when Ed Friedman took me up in his helicopter, and we flew up to a gravel bank in the Kennebec River and then up the Sebasticook River looking for old fish weirs. And as we stepped out on a sandbar, Ed said, well, keep your eyes open. You might see a spear point or something. This was just below where the Sebasticook joins the Kennebec. And lo and behold, my first step on the gravel bar was basically almost on top of this rock. And I'd never found an artifact before. Art Spies assured me it wasn't an artifact, but rather that hole had been carved in it by sharp stones swirling in the current. And since about 2 weeks after I found this stone, it's belonged to Barry Dana, who uses it on the top of a bow drill spindle for every ceremonial fire that he and his Penobscot friends start now. And that's what Barry and I think it was the cap that you held in your left hand if you are right-handed when you were spinning with a bow drill a wooden spindle to create heat and make a fire. But anyway, this is to introduce what I'm calling easy history and hard history. And this is easy history. We all love this sort of history when we find a real piece of history, whether it's on our property or someone else's. This is a piece of history that came from Vinyl Haven, where I work for Vinyl Haven Land Trust. I didn't find it myself, but I'm going to read you just a quick paragraph that was part of something in our Vinyl Haven Land Trust newsletter. It was a short essay called "The Fullness of Place." Here's a question to think about: who or what owns this piece of stone? The ditch digger who took it out of the ground? The man whose backyard it was buried in? The historical society he gave it to? Parted soul whose grave it was placed in 3,000 or 4,000 years ago? Descendants of the culture he came from? Or the land that has held it these several thousand years? Or does it perhaps own itself? And that was the start of an essay where I was asking our land trust members to consider a larger dimension of land. The land trust movement started out of a desperate need to save land, but I think we're at a time now where we can look a lot deeper at what land is. And this is the kind of work that I've been doing, both out of my own interest as a historian and map maker and wannabe linguist, but also in my work as the steward at the Vinyl Haven Land Trust. So when you find pieces of history like this, and when you want to know more about them, as you start learning your way in, you realize that you have to start way back in time. And I'm, although Lee warned you that I'm not going to tell you how long people have been here, but I will say that this is our best reconstruction of where the edge of glacial was over the past 18,000 years. And of interest to me, if you look at the blue circle down in southwestern Pennsylvania, radiocarbon dating at the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter indicates people being there somewhere between 16 and 19,000 years. at a time when our area was under ice. And if you look up at the black circle that says Merry Meeting Bay, you will see the edge of the 14,000 years before present. That's where the ice sheet was 14,000 years ago. And so the next blue line shows where the ice was 13,000 years ago. So that does at least give you an idea of when scientists believe this area cleared of ice. When you are trying to understand how people dealt with such a situation, here's a look at the Gulf of Maine. It's basically just a graded depth chart of the ocean. And you can see that the Georges Bank, Nova Scotia, Cape Cod are all basically part of the same big windrow of gravel that the glacier pushed to the edge of the continent. And the one dark blue band separating them, just the fact that water from all of the rivers draining the uplands had to get out somehow. And so it carved a channel between the Georges Bank and Nova Scotia. But if you imagine, if you look at my 11,000 year ago shoreline, and then imagine people living here and adapting to that changing shoreline over the last 11,000 years, following the edge, which was always the richest part of the ecosystem, and moving back to today's finally shoreline, which starts to get into the yellowish tones. You get some idea of how adaptable people can be and how climate change and sea level change was dealt with quite handily by a people who didn't have as much culture in their lives as we do. When you start trying to learn about people relating to the land, especially with Native Americans, you eventually start realizing that certain things happen in certain parts of the landscape. And you start seeing patterns emerging, patterns about just how rich the tidal zone was, patterns that most medicinal plants came from wetlands, or that the burning that was done in meadows to promote giant oak trees and to promote strawberries were really important food sources, and so on and so on. So you can start understanding people who lived long ago a little bit more deeply when you look at landscape and what it provided them for a living. As you so this is a place, or it's a schematic demonstration of a place named Aquakanonk. And because as part of my learning, I really was hitting a wall. I realized I had to get into language, and spent several years doing that, and got to where I can kind of resolve some place names. And this place, Aquakanonk, which translates to at the fish weirs, when you read the accounts of Moravian missionaries, you can find out that people, and this is Lenape people, who are the grandparents of many of the people who wound up moving to Maine, Native Americans who moved to Maine. Anyway, there's a lot packed into a place name, and refers to the way grapevines with brush attached, weighted down, were used to basically comb the rivers and drive shad or striped bass into the opening of a weir where there was a wooden trap waiting for them. So that layer of language is the next place you go to try and understand people in the land. Here's this will bend your heads a little bit, because the Hudson River, which runs north and south, is shown running east and west in this, but Manhattan Island is the land to the upper left. And these three place names there, when you resolve those, they respectively mean the Sandy Point, at Reckiwanis. The Muscuda, which we call Harlem today, means the burned landscape or the prairie. And Masholu, that's the name for tulip tree, which was the source of the 40-foot long dugout boats that the first Europeans who came to the Hudson River saw. So again, as you gain some facility with the language and can resolve place names, you can start to see people. And when you really get deeply into both language and culture, you can understand why the Cree, who spoke basically the same language as all of the tribes in northeastern North America, why they called an eclipse the widow. And it's because when a Native American woman lost her husband, she would blacken her face for the period of mourning. And when the period of mourning was deemed over, she would paint her face red to show that she was done grieving and was ready to re-enter society. So if you look at the phases of a lunar eclipse and see the normal face, the blackened face, and the red face, then a word like that makes sense to you. So I guess I'm just trying to give you a sense of how many layers of study you can go through to really start seeing it through a less and less of a colonial American lens and more of a Native American. For the last years, I've been working on a project called the Public History Project, and this is why I'm showing you some examples from down in the New York and New Jersey area. That project is a modest attempt to retell the whole human history of the mouth of the river, that whole estuary. And in order to do that project, we felt it necessary to secure the blessings of the Native American groups who originally called it their homeland. And so this took me into what I would call hard history. All of the stuff I've shown you so far is the fun stuff to do and the stuff you can tinker away with, learning at your own speed and reading books. But this gets us into the hard history where we had to convince our Native American collaborators that we could take a stab at understanding what the process of dispossession was like. So hopefully you've had time to read the quote from Meontonimo in 1642, which was kind of it was certainly true, and it was prophetic. It's kind of how history played out for Native Americans here, and I'm going to just go through some of the elements of dispossession for those of us who have never lost our homeland, been removed from it against our will, just so we can, if nothing else, be more grateful for the fact that it hasn't happened to us, but also understand what other people have been through. When you lose your land, you lose all, it's the habitat that the human organism lives in. And these are the components of that habitat that you lose. You have to find a new way of finding all of these elements for yourself wherever you get moved to. Your life ways change, and things that you've been able to do. I'm just thinking maybe I need to move that so you can read it. There, is that better? Okay, we'll try. So all of the things that your family before you, your social group before you has learned to do in that place and enjoys doing in that place is taken away. Your tie to previous generations that's in that place is lost. And the things that keep us going, just the security that it brings us to talk to others, who share the same language or share the same beliefs. As our social network becomes fragmented, our spirit suffers, and eventually spirit can reach a point where we just feel that we can't go on. 2020 is a good example of that for some of us, maybe. And so in looking at all of these elements of dispossession, it seemed very simple to me that the gulf we have to breach for people in our colonial culture to have some idea of what it's like to be people in Native American culture is to acknowledge the differences in our worldview and our belief systems. You know, we come from a culture that subscribed to the delivery, and that any unchristianized land that you came across, you could appropriate for yourself. We come from a culture that believed our species was given dominion over the earth. Native Americans don't share that view, either of those. They don't share the belief that people can own land. They don't share the belief that there's a God who hands the land off to the king of whichever European country discovered it. And most importantly, they don't believe in unlimited resource consumption for the simple purpose of accumulating wealth. And if you look at everything that has been done that has harmed this land in which our colonial culture has settled, that last item seems to be behind a lot of it. So to question our own belief system and to try and understand how Native Americans' worldview was different is our job. You know, when Europeans came, whether it was passenger heath hens or whales that would wash up on the beach or fish that would run up the rivers, all the letters back to Europe were just about the bounty of this new land. And it was a simple equation. If you get ownership of a chunk of land, you own everything in it and you can convert it to wealth, whether it's gravel, whether it's sand, whether it's timber, whatever it is, convert it to dollars. That's the American way, which of course is a great way to gobble up land away from a people who don't share those beliefs. This, I'm going to show you very quickly my public history project work. If you just go from top left down to bottom left, over to bottom, up to top right and down to bottom right, the goal was to show what happened to the Lenape homeland when Europeans came over a couple of centuries. It wasn't even that long. So when we were talking to our native collaborators, I prepared these maps, which required looking at the deeds and where the transactions happened. And you see, as time goes on, so we've come about 150 years by the last slide, and that European encroachment on the Lenape homeland by 1768 is pretty darn complete. And all of the people who shared that homeland before Europeans came are located in a few refugee or shelter communities, I guess is a better word. Refugee is kind of loaded. And some mission groups like the Moravians and the Scottish Presbyterians help them find their way west from their original homeland. And the same thing needs to be done in Maine or in the Northeast, you know, to actually show the dispossession process spreading kind of like a cancer, to understand how Native Americans see it. And these next 12 slides are going to go by very quickly, but it's just looking at the fragmentation of the Lenape homeland schematically. So I'll go through very quickly here, starting with a homeland. Slaves taken from the Lenape and sent to the Caribbean to work in sugar plantations. land purchased and westward movement. The bright purple dot is the Iroquois alliance being better armed by the Dutch so they could take Lenape slaves or captives. Just continual fragmentation, the net population getting smaller from disease as the colonials pushed west. What had been a refugee village or a shelter village is the site of the next massacre. So you keep fragmenting, you keep moving west to Canada, to Wisconsin, to Missouri, to Kansas, to Oklahoma finally. And along the way, you get mixed with other groups that were not part of your initial social group. They might have similar culture and language, but there's mixing nonetheless. And then finally, just dispersion at the individual family level as you try to get yourself invisible, to assimilate yourself into the new dominant culture so you won't be killed just for being Native American. So that's the work there. I'm gonna show you one last example of our work there, and it's about how you have to look at history. If you look at the little orange rectangles on the western end of Long Island, those are the types and sizes of land purchases being made by the Dutch before 1637. In 1637, the English attacked the Pequots in Connecticut and burned 700 of them alive in their village. And after that, after genocide became the official policy of the English, and they were quickly followed by the Dutch, look at the average size of purchases after 1637. Giant chunks of land because no Native American group wanted to be the next Pequots. And that the ripples spreading from the 1637 Pequot massacre were felt up here in Maine just as strongly as they were down there. The rules were changed after that. So I'm sorry to take us afield from your home area, but the story of dispossession of Maine natives needs to be told too, and land trust can help tell it. And I'm gonna just leave this slide up for a second, because when you look at the different ways in which the invading colonial culture was able to dispossess Native Americans from this continent, you really, it's a lengthy list, and I'm not going to read it through for you because I'm going to bring it back now for the last minute or so to tell me, smile, Lee, if that's okay. For the last minute or so to get down to the question that all of us who have a conscience are always asking, what can I do? I went through that phase because, and the easy answer is to say, well, I can't change history, but I can change what happens going forward. But the truth is, you can actually change history, and that's what my work has turned into over the last few years. By telling a truer story, as Lee alluded to, we grew up learning of deeply flawed history, and by however you do it, through research or through getting to know land, through getting to know Native people, you can actually change the stories we tell that make up our history, or that make up land's history. You can find out on land that your land trust owns why there's a path in the woods, find out just how old that path is. Land is the repository of all human history. Everything we do on land leaves a wake. It may be very faint, but there is so much to be learned from land. And Here's the last two examples that I'm going to give you. Some of land's history is hidden. Okay, this is Passaic, New Jersey, on the Passaic River. The big yellow circle up top is underneath the Puritan woolen factory that made all those great clothes back in the 50s and 60s. And when you do some deep diving research, you find out that that factory is built on top of a Native American burial ground that was about 40 acres in size. Just down the block from there is another village site where 20,000 artifacts were found. When they just did a dig in a parking lot, and then the small yellow circle is another graveyard. It used to be on the shore of the Passaic River, but in the 1800s, the Passaic River at that point split and ran around an island. The western branch was filled in with garbage to make more urban space. And so yet another burial ground was covered with fill and then urban fabric. So sometimes you have to look hard to find your history. But other times, if you remember the slide I showed you about Aquakanunk, this is the part of the Passaic River that historically was called Aquakanunk. There was a complex of 16 fish weirs in about a 20-mile stretch of the Passaic River, and you can see some of those weirs are still in existence. They're probably the oldest historic man-made structures in the whole New York metropolitan area by thousands of years, and yet it's just ordinary urban fabric around them, and they sit there in the river unknown, ignored, and not especially protected. And I mention this because fish weirs are something you might find in your work area. The Topsham area, Amoskongon, it meant the fish, the anadromous fish processing place. Those falls, the Pejepscot Falls, were a big hurdle to alewives and shad coming up the Androscoggin River, and it slowed them down enough so that there was a native settlement there, and thousands and thousands of fish were processed there every spring. So keep your eyes open, because sometimes history is hiding in plain sight, and it may be on land that you own. And just bear in mind, if you would, I think all land trusts would do well to remember that if land truly is the repository of our history, conserving land carries with it the burden of conserving history. And so you don't need to feel like it's mission creep for your land trust to invite some historians to play along with you. Okay, I'm sure I've talked long enough. Lee knows I always do, and I will thank you for listening.
Kerry, thank you so much for sharing your more recent research. I think it's really fascinating, your figures showing the displacement of the Lenape people, and I totally agree that there needs to be more work done on making it more accessible to folks to really see how that happened in Maine and in Wabanaki country in the Northeast.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, I was going to say, I think that is the biggest thing that any of us can do to establish a little street cred, and to get some buy-in from Native folks to believe that we're serious. You know, it's okay. It's like any new discipline. It's okay to make well-intentioned mistakes. It's okay if you are slow picking it up, but the effort of at least trying is kind of an important first step if we're going to do this work.
I agree. Okay, well, I would like to now welcome Joseph Hall, Associate Professor of History at Bate College. Bates College.
Thanks, Lee. All right, so first of all, I want to say it's such a pleasure to be able to follow after Kerry's talk. And I'm going to do my best to build on what he's talking about because I think it is so useful. And the way I want to do that is hopefully by remembering what he said while I'm also talking about what I'm doing. So I should have you already looking at my screen. Is that true? Yes, okay, good. And now I'm trying to figure out where I can, oh, here we go, slideshow, that's what I want. Let's start at the beginning. I want to start by first saying my title of 1600 to 1900 is a bit of a fiction because I am hoping to speak both to the present, which would be 2020, and on some level, I'm going a little before 1600, but you get the idea. I'm trying to give a sense of a long stretch of time and not just make this about colonial history traditionally understood as something before the 4th of July, 1776. And I want to really begin with some acknowledgements of both the Wabanaki peoples whose homelands I inhabit, including the Amescogan peoples who I think are the original, or at least the inhabitants of these lands. And by that I mean my lands where I live in Auburn and Lewiston, Maine, but also the lands where I think most of you are in Brunswick and Topsham. And I really hope that what I've learned from many of their descendants is something that I can accurately or at least effectively represent today. A lot of them have taught me a great deal. I want to echo what Kerry has said about the importance of making an effort and making mistakes in the process. I've done a little of one and certainly a lot of the other, and I'll let you decide which is which. But it's certainly, I think, an important part of you have to try, and people have to tell you that you've made a mistake, and then you have to keep trying after an appropriate apology. And I also want to thank you all for this invitation. I'm delighted to be able to talk with you all, in part because I'm interested in what you're interested in and also in the kinds of questions you might have. So why am I not advancing here? Oh, here, oh, that one. So I've got a couple of questions that I think are relevant to you all, but they're also part of what has been interesting to me for a number of years. Most basically, and this is both an easy and a hard question, and I really like Kerry's characterization of hard history. How have Wabanakis and their descendants defined and defended home? And there's a nice little typo to start the whole show. So there's an and supposed to be in before descendants. But part of my secondary question, which is not smaller in many respects, is how does any answer to Wabanaki's efforts to make home in a colonial space, and I think Kerry is right to emphasize the process of dispossession, and also to emphasize the ways that dispossession continues, does not end with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, quite hardly. But so what does it mean to think about cooperative and restorative justice in terms of land and homeland? And I mean that for us, and I'm not speaking just to you, but with you as people who are parts of communities. So in your case, the Land Trust, and in my case, Bates College, where we have, in a sense, for good or ill, responsibilities to manage lands, and lands that are the homelands of Native peoples. So thinking about what that means for us, I think, is really important. And again, it's why I'm so grateful for this chance to talk with you all. Now, I want to start with something that Kerry was also talking about in terms of worldview, and that is that we frequently have a very clear worldview that is almost impossible to avoid and incredibly natural. So for instance, this map, which is a map of the lower Kennebec and the lower Androscoggin, and Merrymeeting Bay is sort of in this lower right-hand-ish corner, represents space in a way that I think most people today are very familiar with. That is to say, it's in a sense done in a cartographic form where you can measure miles and square miles, and in a sense parcel out different things in that process. And then one way that you do that is with this nice convenient line, and you do other lines across the map to draw borders. And this map from 1763 is part of an effort on the part of the Plymouth Company, also known as the Kennebec proprietors, to determine what land was actually there so that they could chop it up into little pieces to be sold to English colonists. Now, there's another parcel or another map that does this as well. And here again, over on the right side is Merry Meeting Bay, and you might even be able to recognize that in the text. But you might also see over here is Topsham. This is the Catance River, and I'm actually not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, because before today I've never heard anyone say the word. So with apologies to those of you who actually know. And then of course below here is Brunswick. And a little fun fact, if you're all interested in trivia, this little line or set of parallel lines that goes from the falls at Pejepscot is Main Street with an E in Brunswick. And it's actually listed as being 6 rods wide, which is 90 feet, which is almost probably the width of that incredibly wide Main Street that you all have. So in a sense, here it is being mapped already circa 1730. And it's incidentally talking about the vestiges, the ways that landscape carries history, this Main Street and how it continues out to Macquoit Bay is actually the portage that Wabanaki peoples followed between Pejepscot, the place of the Rocky Rapids, and Macquoit Bay, where they could basically portage from the Androscoggin or the Merry Meeting Bay to Macquoit without having to do, as you might imagine, a very long run around down the Kennebec and then back up into Casco Bay. So in effect, this map captures a little bit of some of that history that Kerry's talking about. But what it does as well, and I think this is more important for us to recognize right now, is that it's representing space that in ways are almost recognizable to us, even from 3 centuries later. And that is to say, there are lines that mark boundaries, that is to say, in this case that I'm marking out here down below, Brunswick, and then up above, Topsham. That is to say that in many ways, we are conditioned by our maps, by the process of colonization itself, to imagine the landscape in particular ways, and that in a sense is the foundation of a lot of what Kerry's talking about in terms of a process of dispossession, but also a process of a certain logic of exploitation and overuse as well. But I think it's worth thinking about other ways to think about the land and how people have used it. And I look at, and one of the things I'm really interested in is deeds. And let me just sort of say to Kerry, I'm hoping that we can talk some more some other time, because what you're doing with Long Island is actually really interesting to me in terms of what I'm interested in Maine. And so this is a land deed from 1672 between 2 sachems, Sagatowin and Rowandagan, to 2 English colonists, Nicholas Cole and John Purrington. And I'm going to read it out loud because it actually captures 2 forms of understanding land, but only one of them in a sense that I think is immediately recognizable to us. So it's referring to all the land laying in between the 2 carrying places upon Merricaneag, beginning at the head of the westernmost branch of Wigan Cove, so directly over to the western bay of the Bight, and so up along the neck from side to side until they come to the uppermost carrying place at the head of the Wester Bay, at the meadow, which George Fapenny has formerly mowed, so over to the head of the creek that comes from the Easter Bay. So here you have a description of land that in many respects follows what English conventions are for occupying and using land, which is you mark out the boundaries and then you can start to do stuff to it. But this use of the word Merricaneag is really interesting to me because it's obviously not an English word. And so why is it that in an English land sale, English colonists are using what I think is an Amascoggin or a Wabanaki word of some kind? And my answer is that in the course of doing more research in other deeds, especially from the Merry Meeting Bay area, and especially done by Rowandagan himself, is that portages frequently appear as parts of land sales. So here is Merricaneag. You might actually know it as part of the border between Brunswick and Harpswell, particularly at Harpswell Neck. The farm on the Harpswell side is actually known as Merricaneag Farm. Winnegans is another portage. So I should actually say Merricaneag means place of the lazy carry, because the seagrass there means you don't actually have to pick up your canoe. You can just drag it across the mud and the grass and it won't get ripped up by branches or rocks. Winnegans means the little carry, and it is actually referring to the space between Winnegans Creek and Winnegans Bay on the other side of the Phippsburg Bath Peninsula. There were a couple of other portages that appear in some other sales around what's now sort of the Woolwich and Damariscotta region. But even when portages are not mentioned, one of the other frequent mentions is Aroostook, and then some other words that refer to movement and to travel in particular. And I think that fact to me says something interesting about the ways that even in land deeds, and again, just to go back to Kerry's date of 1637, now Maine is different. I think there's a longer period of, if you will, some efforts at accommodation, even in land sales. But you have this insistence on the part of the words being used by Wabanaki peoples in these supposed sales of land that are, in a sense, insisting on continued use of space, particularly for travel, which says to me that Native peoples are not leaving, they're going to be continuing to occupy and to move through the space. And another way to see this is in a different account. This is from 1793. It's not a deed, it's actually a testimony about place names along the Androscoggin. I won't get into why, but that story is itself quite interesting. But here's a man named Père Paul, which you might think of as the French words for Pierre and Paul, or that is to say for Peter and Paul, but he called himself Père Paul. And this is what he had to say in 1793. I, Père Paul of lawful age, testify and say that the Indian name of the river was Pejepscook, from Quabacook, what is now called Merrymeeting Bay, up as far as Amatgonpontook, what the English calls Harris's Falls, and all the river from Harris's Falls up was called Amascongan, and the largest falls on the river was above Rockamacook, about 12 miles, and them falls have got 3 pitches, and for those of you who know the Androscoggin, that would be Rumford Falls. And there is no other falls on the river like them, and the Indians used to catch the most salmon at the foot of them falls, and the Indians used to say, when they went down the river from Rockamacook, and when they got down over the falls by Harris's Falls, they say, now come Pejepscook. Now, it might help for me to show a map of where these places are, of Rockamacook, which is now at Canton Point, and it's actually a fantastic place for growing crops because it's floodplain land, and in fact, the word means good ground, and implicitly, I think, for planting. Amascongan refers to a fish drying place or plenty of fish. Amatgonpontook, the place to catch and dry fish at the falls, and that's where I live. Actually, I go by Amatgonpontook every day on my way between work at Bates College and my home in Auburn. And then you have Pejepscook, the long rocky rapids place, which is mostly buried by the dam that you see when you cross from Topsham to Brunswick. And then Quabacook, which roughly means the waterfowl hunting place, which is Merrymeeting Bay, and of course is a fantastic place to catch lots of birds when they're molting and cannot fly in the late spring and summer. And I just want to go back just to emphasize this idea. I want to emphasize 2 things from this particular statement. The first, which I find almost poetic, well, actually, let's call it poetry, is the imagery that's embedded in this story of the very slow ascent up the river from Quabacook and Pejepscook to Amatgonpontook to Amascongan to Rockamacook and then to the falls above. It takes a tremendous amount of time to go past all of these places, and you turn around and what is it you do? But you basically go by Harris's Falls, watch out for the falls there, and then you're at Pejepscook. It's a delightful way to characterize the imagery of movement on a river, but also what I think is really important about all of these place names is that they all refer to travel in the case of Pejepscook, but even implicitly there, it's about fish, where you can catch a lot of fish at the rapids. All of these are place names relating to food. None of them are place names that show up in land sales to English colonists. And I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is that when Wabanakis are speaking to English colonists and doing so through deeds, which are negotiations about land, they are saying certain things about movement, and they're saying or not saying other things about food and sustenance. And it's an important way to think about both the ways that Wabanakis are continuing to claim these places, but it's also a useful way to think differently about space and about land, and to think in a way that's beyond just, if you will, space as acres and square miles, space as lines, but instead space as webs of connected activity. And I should say activity that is both of creatures, of fish, of water, which are animate, which are living things for Wabanaki peoples, but also activities of peoples themselves, of communities. And it makes all the more powerful what dispossession means, because it's not just what Kerry was characterizing so well of all of these disconnections that occur because of dispossession, but also the ways that communities of people speak about the land and interact with the land and the water, but also the ways that other living things, living beings also are interacting in this network of connections. And that is, in a sense, another kind of geography that I think is embedded in place names and embedded in Wabanaki's understanding of those places. Which means that we should go back to our old maps and look at them a little more carefully. And one of the wonderful things about both of the maps that I've been showing you is that there is actually quite a bit of text to suggest these alternative ways to understand space. Now, most maps have some writing, some maps have a lot. This one that I showed you earlier has a lot, and most of those descriptions are about how these surveyors measured out their lines on the map. But this one in particular that I squared in red has this fascinating excerpt. And for me, it's a puzzle. Like, I don't have an answer to this one. But here you have a native person, an Indian guide, as they refer to it, helping them run a line of 65 degrees northeast. And the Indian showed us, we passed by Catance River, and there's that word I'm not sure I'm pronouncing right. So we altered our course to the river, and the Indian made a draft of Catance Pond and River, it being his part of the country he usually hunted on in the season period. Which pond and river is, to the best of my judgment, represented herein this green line to the Bay of Merrymeeting. Take a note. As English colonists are trying to mark out space with lines, they are doing so in the company of native peoples who are actually giving them descriptions of the land in a very different way and making very explicit their own continued claims to this place. And one of the things I find interesting is that again, this unnamed guide is actually providing guidance to native people, to English colonists, in terms of a name that I think also has to do with travel. So my understanding of the translation of Catance is that it means the principal river, which might seem kind of odd because it's a fairly small river comparatively, but it's principal compared to the Muddy River or to Muddy Brook, which also flows into Merrymeeting Bay, and also principal compared to what I believe is the West Branch, which flows off into Bodenham, or flows from Bodenham into the Catance. And what I think is going on is the Catance is actually referring to this river that is an excellent source of upriver travel when you want to get upstream, but you don't want to deal with the springtime heavy flow of the Androscoggin River. And then you can make a portage, perhaps across the very same route that the surveyors were marking out in this map. But what I'm getting at is that Wabanaki people are marking this place alongside English colonists, and English colonists know it, because if we go to the 1763 map that I showed you, there is this extended description in the top left corner that is basically saying, and I'm not going to read this whole one, but you can see here, it's basically saying Merrymeeting Bay was a fantastic place to catch wild geese every fall, and then from Merrymeeting Bay, the Indians would also go to the coast to gather clams and lobsters. And that they had basically a community at Abegadusset Point, where the French also briefly had a mission. Now, it's easy to read both of these maps, literally reading the maps and the text on them. It's easy to read them as maps describing dispossession, and in many respects, they are. These are maps of English colonists marking out a new kind of landscape, and native peoples, in a sense, having to abandon some of the ways that they live on that landscape in order to survive, basically to avoid being killed, as Kerry rightly pointed out. But I think it's also worth remembering that these are claims that don't disappear, they just change. And so this is a map actually from the middle 1800s, or it's made in 2015. It's part of the Historical Atlas of Maine, which is a fantastic book for all sorts of things. But one of the things I think it does quite well is illustrate the ways that native peoples are still part of the history of Maine, even long after, if you will, the colonial period is supposedly over. And what this map shows, the map done by Micah Pauling, who's at the University of Maine, is where it is that native peoples from the Penobscot Reservation near Old Town on the Penobscot River, and from the Passamaquoddy reservations near what's now Princeton, Maine, and also at Zebaig near Eastport, are part of networks of movement. Here we are again. These movements to resources in different places, whether it's the blueberry harvest down east, basket making places along the coast for tourists, or up in the Moosehead Lake region. And then in addition, you have these red dots that are basically places where Micah Pauling in his research has found Wabanakis, Penobscots, and Passamaquoddies sending petitions to the state legislature to say, we would like some money to help us get home to Old Town and to the Passamaquoddy communities. And basically what they're doing is they're saying, we're going back and forth to these other places that are not part of the reservation, but they're still part of our homeland. Now, I want to make clear two things. First, and I hope obviously from all of the arrows and all of the dots, Native peoples are continuing to inhabit places, including Brunswick, Cape Elizabeth, Portland, that are considered very far from Native homelands. But in addition, this map does not show Native peoples who are actually living in these areas and not part of the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy communities, in a sense, who are not, as far as the state of Maine is concerned, officially Indian people. And those numbers are certainly small. And I think Kerry also pointed out that they are generally in small groups because it is dangerous to be Indian in Maine, but they're still here or there, or were at the time, and in a sense are still in the present. And I think that fact is important to recognize both in the 1800s, but also, this is why I wanted to say this story goes through to 2020, but also in the present. So to sort of wrap things up, what does this mean in terms of how Wabanakis have defined and defended home? And at the very least, it's about movement, and it's important to think about movement and not just in terms of thinking about land in terms of parcels. But colonization has required Native peoples to adapt, to change. And that change means that it's important to look for Indians in places you do not expect, because in the same way that we've been taught histories of Native disappearance, and I say we, people in the dominant US colonial society, have been taught stories of disappearance, we've also been taught that Native peoples are basically always stuck in the past. So if they do things like ride a train to sell baskets to tourists, they're not really Indians. Or if they, in a sense, if they move, if they set up, if they live in Brunswick and have a job behind a desk and talk to people on a telephone and drive a car, they're not really Indians. Those are fallacies that are, in a sense, aids to colonization and to Indian disappearance. And in a sense, recognizing Native people's continued existence and continued creativity to survive despite a colonization that seeks to dispossess them requires that we look carefully and rethink a lot of our preconceived notions about what space is, but also who people are. Now, what does this mean in terms of cooperative and restorative justice? Now, there's a lot of text here. I really like Kerry's slideshow better than mine. He's good at his job. But forgive me for lots of words. But I wanted to write these down in case somebody wanted to see them later. These are ideas that I've come to from my own research, but also from conversations with Wabanakis, including some of you might know. But I think it's really important to ask this, why is it important to think about cooperative and restorative justice? Who is this for? And to put it simply, I think a wrong answer is to feel less guilty. But I think it's really important to ask, why is this work happening? And I'm asking this question at Bates College as well. So I don't want to say this is something you need to do. I think this is something that everyone needs to do. And to the extent that Wabanakis should be involved, and I think of course they should, it's important to be aware that with a varied history that is also violent and traumatic, asking people to participate in these conversations is not an easy request. To talk about this history and to think about what it means for the present is asking people to recapitulate experiences that are painfully unpleasant. And what that also means, I think, is in thinking about how or who you ask, or who we ask, that it be thought about in terms of communities. And I think REACH is a fantastic community. It's not what you would call a community in the same way that the Penobscot Nation is a community, but it is certainly a community of activists who are committed to Native identity and Native resurgence. And it's worth thinking about not finding the Indian or an Indian or a couple of Indians or Wabanakis, if you want to be more precise, and saying, hey, what do you think about this? This is about, in a sense, rebuilding and restoring communities, and communities in the land requires talking with communities as well. And then I think relating to all of this work, as you think about the land, it's important to think in terms of networks. I think parcels are really important. Don't get me wrong. There are good reasons for that. But I think it's also worth thinking about how places, specific places in space are connected, and those connections are actually part of what place and what home is. And that Wabanakis, by continuing to inhabit these places, don't necessarily need permission to do so. So that's where I'm going to wrap up, and I hope that Kerry and Maya's double header has not exhausted you so much that you have no questions or interest in anything else that we have to talk about. But thank you again for this chance.
Joe, thank you so much for sharing some of your research, as well as some of your interests of why you feel this research is important. I really appreciate that. I do want to make sure we get into some questions to have time to do that. A reminder to all of the attendees, if you have questions, please just enter them in the Q&A field at the bottom. To start with, there's a question around some confusion on terms that we're using to refer to the people in our area. Amoskegon and Ameriskegon were both brought up today. This actually, I welcome you both to respond to this, but it reminds me of what I found a really valuable section in Kerry's book about how many of these names were names selected by the settlers. They were certainly words that were being used by the indigenous people, and yet names were given to groups by the colonists. So Kerry, do you want to talk a little bit about those naming mechanisms? Oh, Kerry, you're muted.
How's that? Okay.
There you
Yeah.
go.
So what I will quickly say is something that I say all the time, is that if you want to start understanding Native American society in the Northeast, don't look to separate groups, but rather look at what they have in common, because there's a dizzying number of group names that are just geographic descriptors of where they live. I mean, it's like saying they're Bostonians. That doesn't tell you anything about people's culture or ethnic background or anything else, right? It's just that they live in Boston. And all of these Native American groups, it served the colonial purposes to break them into smaller and smaller groups and say this is a separate tribe, when in fact they had the same language, the same genealogical tree, but they just lived in different places. So in our case, the English were quick to appoint you'll see the name in old Indian deeds, Captain so-and-so, referring to the Native American who was signing off on the sale. The English loved to make captains, especially of Indians that they found willing to deal with them, and to advance them above others in their group, whether or not they were entitled to that. If you would talk turkey with the English, then you could become Captain somebody. But all of the place names that you see, Penobscot means, this is my take on it, just at the Rocky Place. So many of these are just descriptors of where a village is. And the groups are not distinct. They're all one culture. As you move from one geographic region to another, you get fusion groups that combine elements of the groups on either side of them. But it's more important to just say these are all Eastern Algonquian speaking people of this woodland culture. And I'm talking about who the first Europeans encountered here. And of course, they put them through the mill since then and turned them into someone else. But all of the names are just so much chaff when we're trying to understand social ties and the culture of the people.
Do you want to add anything about names that we use?
Yeah, sure. I think Kerry is right. I agree. I mean, it's always, yeah. So I agree with Kerry that names are really important and also dangerous because often they're forms of division. I remember somebody once saying, think of the rule of the playground. And basically, if somebody says you're calling me names, you should listen to them. So in other words, I'm putting this in contemporary terms now. If somebody says I'm Wabanaki, or I prefer that you not use the term Indian, I think that's important. I mean, in the same way that I don't want somebody calling me Joey, ever. So there are certain things that I think are important to keep in mind just as forms of respect. I also think it's important to recognize too that names represent division and identity, and those kinds of things are fluid and difficult to track sometimes. I also don't want us to get too caught up in the idea that all Native peoples, all Wabanakis got along. In fact, they didn't, and that we should be shocked if any community of any people, a large group of people got along. I think even this country, I think, is a living example of that. So I don't want us to over romanticize in the other direction that all Wabanakis always got along and did everything together. So there were divisions. Some people recognize those names, but what those names represented is always going to be fluid. I noticed that part of the question too had a question about Amerascoggin, or no, not Amerascoggin. Oh gosh, now I'm blanking on the word. But there's Amercongan or shoot. It was
trying to look at it. Amerascoggin or Amoscoggin.
Yeah, and then there's another word, but basically that actually refers to people at the headwaters of the Connecticut River.
Anastaguntacook.
Exactly, thank you.
Yeah.
Anastaguntacook or Arastaguntacook, at least from what I've read, and I'm not an expert in this period or in this area, but the northern Connecticut River Valley was where those peoples were from. They moved to Odanak, which is a mission town in Quebec. Many people from the Amascoggin region also moved there, and I think as a result, some scholars have mixed them up in a way that I think is not accurate, but it's an understandable confusion. So.
Got it.
Okay, and I would add to that, Farmington Falls, up the Kennebec drainage on the Sandy River, Amosaconte is it just means where we get lots of alewives, and that was the Native American name for that place. But so many of the place names that have an AMAS in them, that's always a marker to anadromous fish. That and it's telling you something about a place where those fish were taken, where they were important.
Got it.
And cat harness too. Just because you mentioned it, Joe, I will tell you that's the Lenape word for arrowhead, an aquatic plant that has an edible bulb on it, and that river is full of them. And so you see it written Katniss in a Lenape dictionary, but Catanus or Catanus is the early pronunciation of that place. So my money would be that it's talking about the arrowhead plant there, but that's just my 2 cents worth on it.
And if attendees want to go see some arrowhead plant on the Cadance River on a land trust conserved property that we conserved in partnership with the town of Topsham, go check out just below the falls at Head of Tide Park, and you'll see lots of arrowhead there. The next couple questions are questions about resources, literature that covers these topics, as well as one person saying she's a preschool teacher. And, I think this is one of the big challenges that many folks have is the resources we feel like we have to share are talking about the Wabanaki people as people in the past. Yeah. And I would also share with our attendees, maybe I find this an interesting parallel. In the state of Maine, there is an unfunded mandate that every classroom should be teaching environmental education, and there's an unfunded mandate that every classroom needs to teach Wabanaki culture. So I feel like there's some synergy that could happen there, but definitely a need for resources for teachers who do want to do that teaching, as well as for the rest of us that would like to learn. So I wonder what resources you all might suggest.
The first place I would go for educational resources is the Abbey Museum and their website. So ABBE Museum in Bar Harbor. They have, there are different nooks and crannies to the website, as with most websites, but there's quite a bit of educational material, and some of it includes lesson plans, also recommended reading, and some web material that you can actually refer to right there on the web. So that would be my first recommendation, especially for educators in the K through 12 or even K through 16 sort of range. And then I think more generally, I saw a different question about just sort of reading resources. I think Kerry's bibliography at the end of Notes on a Lost Flute has a lot of really good suggestions. Obviously, he used them for his research, so it's productive material. I honestly can't remember if anything's been published since then that would be really good. I think, well, let me give you one answer to that. For those who are interested in educating themselves as adults, as opposed to educating younger folks, a book by Lisa Brooks called Our Beloved Kin, which is primarily about King Philip's War, which is primarily located in southern New England, actually has quite a bit about Native history in New England generally, but also some very good history that's centered in what's now sort of southern Maine. So that's another thing that comes to an example to my mind. And yeah, the education hub of the Abbey Museum is what Heather Augustine just sent to. So that would be the part of the website that you should look for.
I don't have much to add, except that there's a lot of good primary histories digitized and available online. And that was probably the most important set of resources that I found. It is worth reading what people in the first person, like Champlain or Rozier, saw and recorded when they came here, in the early 1600s. And eventually, after you see enough of them, you do develop the ability to read between the lines and not see the world through their colonial filter so much as or to see beyond it. So Verrazano in 1524, if you're reading his account, and he says the coast for these last 300 miles has been one continual fire, and it's in September, and this is Native American burning of the land to promote early successional food-bearing species. So whatever your own experiences, and in my case it was ecology, you do learn to read between the lines in those primary accounts and get more information than they thought they were telling you.
That's great. And I also I shared a link to the First Light Learning Journey webpage, which has a huge number of resources listed there. So I encourage you to check that spot out as well. And let's see, there were some questions about some clarifications on a reservation in southern Maine. We've typed those answers in, so feel free to add more if that wasn't clear, to enter more questions if that wasn't clear. But I was going to bring up the next question, which was around the example in California of a land trust that works to preserve native sacred sites. And I'm not sure if you're speaking to sort of a standard land trust that has a mission focus in that direction. There is also a handful of Native American-led conservation organizations, which is relatively new and an important, I think, new step in the conservation movement. And your question was, could such an effort be undertaken in Maine? I'm not sure if either of you want to speak to that in terms of what your experience is. I can also share some more of what's going on with First Light in terms of that effort.
Yeah, that is what occurred to me too, Lee, is that First Light is really trying to be the first one across that gulf between land trusts and Native people, and is really doing some good work. But I would say also that it is time for land trusts to start thinking about having Native Americans on their boards and among their membership. And you know, I don't know, every land trust is different, but I would certainly hope if that there would be no financial barrier for any Native American person who wanted to be part of the land trust I work for. I would hope that we would find a way to make that happen. And I do hope that we get a Native American board member someday soon.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just to build on Kerry's comment and then go back to the other part of the question, I would say that kind of work is important to do as a community building effort. I think I'm just thinking about this from the perspective of Bates College, where there's a lot of interest in diversity and equity work, and in a sense has been part of the college for many years. But frequently that gets misdirected to, hey, let's find the representative of whichever group you're talking about and find them and get them on our board, and in a sense consider that to be appropriate work, when in a sense it's almost more like you're singling somebody out. And given how much the colonial process and the process of dispossession has involved atomizing communities and making communities into individuals, I think that can be a dangerous kind of identifying and identity politics. So I know, again, I'm not dissuading or discouraging any of that work. I would want to say, be careful, respectful, deliberate about that kind of community building and alliance building. It's going to happen because people are actually developing relationships, not because you look up in the phone book, find the Native American and call them.
Right.
And back to the question about the land trust and sacred land. So forgive me if I go on a long tangent, but one of the things I taught in France for a semester. I was really lucky to be a teacher for Bates College in France, and one of the things a lot of students said to me was they were super excited to go to France because France had so much history, and you can walk in places that cathedrals that are thousands of years old and be in these Roman ruins and all the rest. North America has just as much history. It's just that part of that history has involved the explicit and sort of committed effort to erase it. And Passaic, New Jersey is an excellent example of that. I think Kerry's images are wonderful in that respect. So one of the things that I think about is that when we talk about preserving sacred sites, and there are some in Maine that are sort of identified as specific ceremonial sites, that's, I think, worth doing to the extent that it is possible. But I think it's also worth remembering that every site is sacred on some level. I mean, it's native land that was, in a sense, sacralized by the continued use of and respect for what it meant. So like, it's really important to be careful not to sort of say, well, where's the church and let's protect that.
Yeah.
As opposed to like, where's the life and how do we want to protect that? And where is the life not just as it was, which I think is the dangerous thing, that there's some sort of a preservationist sort of ethos that is about, let's find those things that are frozen in time and keep those there, locked in, if you will, ice or amber. And instead, what's the life and the ceremony and the sacredness that we want to actually preserve, but even cultivate now? And what is it that we want to build now? And that will perhaps be something much in the same way that basket makers in Bar Harbor is going to be something totally new and innovative for whatever the time and whatever the needs are of a particular time. I think that's worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, sure. And that makes me think of the alewife run at Damascotta Mills, for instance, as an example of sacred space, and it ought to be sacred to all of us. Yeah.
Yes, I'm reminded of a Wabanaki speaker that we heard from recently through First Light saying, the federal government assured that we have the right to practice our religion as Wabanaki people without really recognizing that hunting and fishing and gathering and being on the land is our religion. That is what is sacred to us. It's not just ceremonies and special items.
Right.
Okay, well, in the interest of it being a little bit after 6, I want to wrap us up. I want to thank both of you so much for sharing with us tonight, and let all of the panelists know that we will follow up with the recording and sharing the slides that our speakers shared with you tonight. And with that, I'm going to let Emily Swan close us out for the evening.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you so much to our panelists. That was such an enlightening presentation, and certainly just the very beginning of lots of learning for all of us. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to our event sponsor, Eaton Peabody. And I want to let you know that next week, a recording of this evening will be on our website, along with links to the film Dawnland and updates from this event and many resources. So you can go to btlt.org next week to find those things. And for those of you who have joined us who are not members, we're very happy to have you at this presentation, but also at btlt.org is the opportunity to join the Brunswick-Topsham Land Trust. So we hope that you will consider joining if you're not already a member. Also, in a couple of weeks, we'll be sending out a survey asking what you thought of the presentations tonight and what your interests are around this topic to help the Land Trust understand how we can best engage with the community on these issues. So be looking for that. As registrants of this session, you will be receiving that survey. So thank you all for coming, and I encourage you all to get out on the Land Trust properties and enjoy nature all seasons of the year. And we enjoy spending the evening with you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all. So long.